explanation. Okay, here's the first premise of the cosmological argument, or CA, the argument from contingency. Either every being is dependent, that is, either everything there is a dependent being, or there's at least one necessary being. The second premise says not every being is dependent. So what follows, therefore there must be a necessary being. So this argument gives us two options. Either everything is dependent or there's at least one necessary thing. It then eliminates that first option. It can't be that everything's dependent. And so it follows there must be at least one necessary being. So that first premise, either everything is dependent or there's a necessary being, is not definitionally true. We need to give it a defense, or the defender of the argument does. Why think that? Why couldn't there be something that's neither dependent nor necessary? Well, here's the idea. It is trivially true, the first step. Either every being is contingent or there's a necessary being. Those are the only two options, logically, contingent or necessary. The PSR says, this is the second step, every contingent being is dependent. So if the PSR is true, it follows that either every being is dependent or there's a necessary being. That's the first premise. The second premise is the one that takes a little more work to defend. Why think that it couldn't be that every single thing there is caused to exist by something outside of itself? Why think that not everything is dependent? Okay, to start, let's call collection C the complete collection of every contingent being that actually exists, that ever has existed in the past, or ever will exist in the future. Dinosaurs, put them in the collection. Planet Earth, in the collection. Tokyo, in the collection. New York, in the collection. Every atom there ever was or ever will be, in collection C. You can see this is a very big collection. Indeed, it's probably infinitely large. Keep that in your mind now. Consider all of the contingent things there are, the things that exist but didn't have to. The first step of the defense of the second premise says this: collection C is itself contingent. So not just each individual member, but the whole thing. Yes, it exists, but it didn't have to. Why think that? Well, here's a brief reason, potentially why. Collection C is just composed of contingent parts. Every one of its parts is contingent. Now, if I remove just a single part, that is, if I consider a possible scenario where one of the parts does not exist, one of those worlds where, say, my parents never met, is collection C still around? Well, no, now it's a new collection. It's got one less part. It's an entirely different collection of things. Maybe there's a new item in that collection now. Certainly then it's a different collection. And indeed, if we keep removing parts, there are going to be possible scenarios with very different collections of contingent things. And the collection that actually is not that collection. So in other words, collection C itself exists but didn't have to. So it's contingent. That's the reasoning behind this first step in the defense of the second premise. Now, once we have the claim that collection C is contingent, the second step says the PSR is true. So this is the second time that PSR has been invoked in the argument. The PSR says every contingent being is dependent. The third step says only contingent beings are dependent. We talked a little bit in class about the reasoning behind 2.3. I'm not going to go into it here, other than to say very briefly, the thought is that the only beings that require an explanation outside of themselves are contingent ones. If you're not contingent, then you're necessary. And then there's no need for there to be something outside of a necessary being that causes it to be. So only contingent beings are dependent. Okay, so the fourth step, everything else now is going to logically follow from these first three steps. So if we look at the first step in the defense, collection C is itself contingent, pair that with the claim that the PSR is true, that every contingent being is dependent. it follows that collection C is itself dependent. Every contingent being is, and collection C is contingent, so C must also be dependent. Well, what does it mean for something to be dependent? It means that there's something outside of that being that causes it to be. So when we pair that definition of dependence with the claim that collection C is dependent, we now know that there's something, call it X, outside of collection C that causes it to exist. Now, what else do we know about X, this thing outside of collection C? Well, we know that it is not contingent. How do we know that? Well, collection C, remember, is complete. It's the complete collection of every contingent being there is. There's no contingent being that exists that's not already inside collection C. So conversely, if you're something that's outside collection C, you're not contingent. So whatever X is that causes collection C to exist, it's not a contingent thing. Now, 2.3 says that only contingent beings are dependent. It follows from 2.3 and 2.6 that therefore there is something X, that thing that causes this collection C to exist, that isn't dependent. We know it's not contingent, and we know it's not dependent. What's another way of saying that there is some X that is not dependent? A simpler way of putting that is not everything that exists is dependent, because there's at least one thing that is not dependent. But that's just premise 2. So that's the defense of the second premise. That thing X, neither contingent nor dependent, so not everything is dependent. So that's the argument from contingency. It follows from that there's a necessary being, and of course we now know that that necessary being, if the argument works, is this thing X. So it's not just any old necessary being, it's one that brought about everything else there is. And the theist looks at that and says, what else do you want? We've got something that exists but would have existed no matter what, and that brought into existence everything else, everything we see around us. That's God. Now, in class we talked about 2 bad objections to the argument and 1 better objection. I'm just going to talk about one of the bad objections and then very briefly mention the better objection. I'm going to leave out the what caused God objection. You should still know that. Here is the so-called infinite series objection that plagued earlier versions of this argument. Here's the thought. What if every contingent thing there is caused to exist by something prior that is itself also a contingent thing, that itself also is caused to exist by something prior, that is itself also a contingent being that is caused to exist by something prior, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on, ad infinitum. In other words, what if every single contingent thing is dependent? Then every single thing, conceivably, would be dependent. What does this require? What does it involve? Well, it just requires everything in a series of beings to have a cause in terms of some prior being in the series, some distinct being. Prior versions of the cosmological argument said the arguments basically had the form of, in every series of causes, there has to be a first one, an uncaused cause that causes everything else. And so often opponents of the cosmological argument would say, why? Why can't it be that time stretches backwards infinitely into the past, and for any given being you could locate in time, it has a cause in terms of some prior being? Everything is explained. If you like the PSR, you'll love this. Every single thing is explained without exception. Why do we need a first one? So that was a good objection to that version of the cosmological argument. An infinite series, if there could be one, would be a series of contingent beings such that every being in the series depends for its existence on something prior to it. There could be such a series, then earlier versions of the argument were doomed. Why is this a bad objection to this version of the argument? Well, there's a lot to say, but in brief, if we look at the structure of the defense of the second premise, it directly addresses this possibility. So right in the first line here, we have collection C is contingent. Once you grant that, the rest of the argument, so the thinking goes, moves on from there. Well, what is collection C? Collection C just is the complete collection of all contingent beings. Now, collection C may or may not be infinite in length. Maybe there's a finite number of contingent things. Maybe there's a stopping point in a first contingent thing. Or maybe not. Maybe there's infinitely many, and maybe each of them depends on some prior one. Still, if the whole thing, if all infinitely many of those contingent things is itself contingent, as that first claim in the defense says, then the PSR says all of them taken together are dependent. And so there must be something outside of that infinitely many large collection. So the cosmological argument from contingency is designed precisely to address this worry. And it says, sure, maybe collection C is infinitely large. Maybe it's an infinite series, maybe not. Either way, the PSR says there better be something outside of it. So we're up and running. That's why it's not a good objection to this version of the argument. Of course, that doesn't mean that there's no good objection to this argument. I leave you to consider whether the PSR is true. I mean, we saw that in two different points in the argument, the PSR is doing important work. If the PSR is false, then the two defenses of the premise of the two defenses, the defense of premise 1 and the defense of premise 2, both fall apart. So what would it take for the PSR to be false? Well, what we would need would be a counterexample to the PSR. That is an example of an actual or even a possible or conceivable being that both is contingent, but that lacks a cause outside of itself. Something that's contingent but not dependent. In class, we talked about some very strange, I will admit, possible counterexamples to the PSR, but any such counterexample is bound to be kind of weird. Everything that we encounter that's contingent in ordinary experience certainly is dependent. So the examples that undermine the PSR, if there are any, probably are going to be outside of our ordinary experience. Some people, we talked about in class, interpret quantum physics as having counterexamples, as providing us with counterexamples to the PSR. It seems like the location of a photon in the double slit experiments maybe is contingent but doesn't have a cause. Or maybe it's, in some interpretations, it's whether the photon is a wave or a particle is a contingent fact, but nothing causes it. A little less extravagantly, and I think a little more plausibly, you might think that human free decisions, we talked about this in class, are contingent but non-dependent entities. I decided to make this video, could very easily not have. So my decision is a contingent thing. What does it depend on other than my deciding, other than sort of itself? Well, on one conception of freedom, at least, there's nothing outside of it that causes it to be. And to the extent that we're tempted to think, well, there are prior determining causes, to that extent, it's no longer free. So if you have this conception of freedom according to which free decisions have to have no prior sufficient causes, you might think human free decisions are counterexamples to the PSR. We didn't talk about this one, but you can think a little bit about it. Terminator style backwards causation via time travel. I'm just going to throw that out there. If you have other examples, that would be really interesting to talk about in your essays on the exam. All right, so that is a better objection and one that I think has more plausibility than the other two. I hope this was helpful, and good luck.